Snow was falling in the weirwood grove the first time Brienne of Tarth stood before the heart tree and named herself aloud to the old gods. The flakes came straight and soft, without a wind to trouble them, settling on the red leaves like ashes on embers, and the face carved into the pale bowl watched her with a sorrow that was not unkind. Her breath plumed and vanished. The steel of Oathkeeper drank the light, a dark red she had never thought to call beautiful, and could not help loving as one loves a scar that has healed correctly. She held the sword down, both hands on the crossguard. The point anchored in packed snow as if she meant to root herself in the same earth that held the bones of kings. "I am Brienne," she said, because the heart tree would not know her by titles. She did not add the clumsy weight of sir, or lady, or commander. Snow ticked against her hair and melted. "I have sworn to guard the daughter of the woman I failed." The word failed came up like iron. Saying it aloud had never made it lighter. The gods' wood listened with its red leaves, and the moat lake beyond lay sheeted with ice that breathed faintly, bumping as the darkness settled underneath. The trunks of the other trees, bearded with hoarfrost, leaned like old men at council. "All the oaths I break leave their taste," she went on. "I would have them see me try again." Behind her, the grove was not empty. She had not asked for witnesses, but the North had its own stubborn sense for the moments it wanted to keep. The queen was standing under a snow-wet bough with a gray cloak drawn close. Her hair was the color of copper coins left long in the rain, worked into a single braid that disappeared at her shoulder, and on her gloved hands there was a ring of dark iron inlaid with a thread of silver. Sansa Stark was slight in her winter furs, made statelier by the stillness she wore like armor. Beside her, Podrick shifted from foot to foot, trying not to, a knight as new to the title as a colt to its first saddle. Hallis Mullen had come too, the beard on his broad face stiff with frost, the black of Winterfell's guardsmen stark against the snow. Behind them, farther off, a woman stood half hidden by the trunk of a great elm. Taller than most, with a bear's head sewn in green thread on the shoulder of her cloak, and an expression that would cut careless fingers. Elizan of House Mormont, Brienne had been told, and another young woman crouched near the frozen lake, barely ruffling the snow as she moved, her hood fringed with threads the color of peat water. "Reed," she had said when introduced, with no other name offered, "from the Crannogs." These were to be some of the shields she would command. Sansa stepped closer. "The old gods do not demand a formal rite," she said softly, "not to disturb the gliding hush of the grove. But they do not forget." "So Ryman Greenhands told a raven one winter," Alysanne murmured, and Hallis made a sound that could have been a laugh if it had not been carried away by cold. Brienne looked up. The tears that had threatened in the corners of her eyes when she first knelt had dried without falling. Shame had a warmth of its own, and she had learned to stand with it. "Your Grace," she said, and the title cost nothing to speak. This was a vow she had carried in her bones long before it wore a name. "I will not keep you on your knees," Sansa replied, but she did not smile. There was kindness in her and iron too. Brienne had seen it in the same glance before, in the face of a girl refusing to be led to a gate, in the face of a woman who had mastered a hall of men by hearing them to the end. "Rise, Brienne of Tarth." When Brienne stood, the world seemed to slow to the pace of snow drifting. She felt for a foolish instant as if she might leave prints on the air. Podrick came forward then, Sir Podrick Payne in a cloak too thin for the night, and placed across her forearms the length of cloth they had argued over by a low fire 2 nights before. The white of the South would not do, Sansa had said at once. White cloaks in the North were for ghosts and for shrouds, and for the crows that watched white fields. House Stark had said Queen, but the old gods had laughed at such bright certainty. They had chosen to weave gray, like wolf fur in winter, and sewn into the hem a border of red leaves so small that a careless eye would miss them. 7 would be a southern number, Sansa had said then. But there are old 7s in the North too. 7 gods, some say. Others say the oldest count is 3. I will not ask for luck we do not own. I will ask for oaths. Now she touched the cloak with 2 fingers as Brienne held it, and nodded once to Alysanne. The she-bear came forward and fastened the clasp that bore the stark direwolf in hammered iron, heavy enough to be believed. The fur brushed Brienne's wrists with a weight that felt like an honest hand. It did not change the straightness of her stance, but it altered, slightly, the shape of her shadow. Brienne of Tarth, Sansa said, and the Winter Grove made a chamber for her voice. You came north for a vow made to my mother. If you will, take a vow to me now, to stand between me and the swords of the world, to speak to me the truth I need, to hold my name clean, to keep my counsels, and to give me your life if need be, until I release you or death does. I will, Brienne said. The words were not new. They were the oldest she had ever owned. I swear it before the faces in these leaves and all the gods that hear. The heart tree did not stir. The snow hissed faintly, a slow whisper that had nothing to do with them. Brienne felt the oath go down like a draft after a long thirst. It did not make her light. It steadied the heaviness she carried and made it useful. Then stand, Lady Commander, Sansa said. Stand for the Queensguard of the North, such as we will make it. She had told Brienne the choice of name had not been made for style. If the North must name things, the Queen had said, let them be named for the weight they will carry. I have had enough of titles that are all guilt. Now, as they walked back across the pale ground, Brienne felt the weight settle into place across her shoulders and thought, it is easier to bear a stone when it is shaped to sit there. The long day that followed began early, as winter days do, because dawn had the patience of a wolf and came later than a southerner liked. In the training yard, the snow had been trampled to a gray paste by 100 boots. Men swung blunted swords and whickered when the edges clashed. The ring of steel had a thinner sound in the cold, and the breath of the fighters came in chuffs that hung a heartbeat before they were lost in the white air. Brienne stood in her cloak at first, long enough to be seen wearing it, long enough that men and women turning their heads would mark its gray and the dynasty on its clasp. Podrick stood behind her with his visor up, red-cheeked and alert. Alizin Mormont stood with her hands folded into her armpits and watched like a captain of a ship certain of the currents she read in the clouds. Hallis Mullen argued in undertones with a boy about a shield that had lost its strap. The Reed girl, Yana, Brienne had learned, who still refused a family name though everyone knew it already, was not there at first, and then she was, ghosting at the edge of the yard the way a shadow finds the seam where two walls meet. Hallis, Brienne said at last, let them see me earn my cloak. He grunted and nodded. She unfastened the clasp and handed her new honor to Podrick with the care she gave Oathkeeper, watched his hands fold the gray and red into a weight a little too solemn for him, and stepped on to the packed circle of snow. No man or woman in the yard needed a speech to know who she was. Some had watched her on the night the dead came, moving through the press with that impossible sword, as if it weighed no more than a reed. Others had only stories, and stories grew meat on their bones in the north when told by those who had walked in winter. Brienne did not say her name. She drew Oathkeeper, and did what truth demands. She showed them. She moved slow at first. The blade turned, a careful arc through the thin air. Once, twice, 3 times. The habit of years. No flourish, only balance. Her shoulders remembered what no wind could strip away. The long hours of her girlhood when she had made strangers laugh by being too large for a dance, and then made them fall silent by being too unyielding to be moved by laughter. She had trained in courtyards where men had mocked, and men had offered advice she had not asked for, and men had tried to teach her to bear her sword like a woman. She had learned to bear it like Brienne. The first to come at her was Alysanne, because of course it would be. The she-bear had taken up a long-hafted axe as easily as a maid gathers up her skirts and brought it in low, up from the line of the knee. Brienne met steel with steel and slid. The axe arrested, wavering, and Alysanne grinned, teeth white and wild in the cold. Good, she said. I don't like pretty. Then you will like me very well, Brienne answered, and turned the next blow. By the time Podrick stepped in, the yard was quieter. She gave him no gift she would not have taken herself. He had grown into his strength without losing the earnestness that had first made her trust him. His footwork had improved. He had outgrown the habit of glancing to her for permission when the opening was there. Oathkeeper's weight in her hand spoke in the letters that were not letters burned down its length. No language belonged to those shapes, and yet she knew them the way a scar knows its story. She turned the boy's sword with the flat and let him feel where he had overreached, then showed with a brief check of her shoulder how to bring it back and let his momentum make a hinge of his hip. After Podrick came a guardsman with hair like straw and a scar that pulled his mouth left when he smiled. Then came a woman from White Harbor with a pair of short swords she used like knitting needles, quick and precise. Brienne gave each what they had asked for and what they had not known to ask. Her shoulder ached, and then forgot it knew how. She knew she was teaching not only them, but everyone who watched. A commander is always instructing by what she endures in silence. Sansa watched from the edge of the yard with Maester Walken at her shoulder and Lord Davos beside him, the Onion Knight wrapped in a cloak too plain for any court that was not theirs. It seemed Davos had become a ship that came and went from Winterfell, as if a tide moved beneath him that no other ship felt. He was listening and measuring. Sansa, watching Brienne, was neither measuring nor tempted to say so. She looked as if she were watching the making of something that had already been hers, as if seeing its shape solid was a grief and a pleasure both. When the yard had enough of blows for a morning, and the mended shields were more mended than whole, Brienne sheathed Oathkeeper and took back the cloak from Podrick. Its fresh weight was a welcome thing. The guardsmen dispersed like starlings shaken from a hedgerow, in quiet talk of what they had seen, and what they would try later in pairs when the overseer's eyes were elsewhere. Alysanne fell into step beside Brienne, and jabbed her in the arm with one blunt finger. "You a southern knight's patience," the she-bear said. "It will do here until someone decides it won't. Don't mistake quiet for gentleness." "I have never made that mistake," Brienne said. Alysanne looked at her again and nodded once, as if something she had wanted to confirm had been confirmed. "Good. When the fishwives come to throw fish in the Queen's yard because the river paused under ice and men went hungry, remember I told you, the North loves a story. It loves to test if the story will fight back." Then they went to council. Winterfell's small hall had been chosen for the morning's work, not the great one. Fires had been built up in both, and the lesser heat felt more honest. The smell of burning oak and the faint copper of hot iron filled the long room. And a table had been brought in that might have been older than Brienne herself, scarred and darkened where generations had leaned their elbows and pounded answers with fists. Sansa took her seat at the head and did not tighten her mouth when she looked down the ranks of benches and saw who had come. The North did not always come in the faces you would have called first. There was a man from the Dreadfort with a heavy bandage where 2 fingers had learned too late not to wear the Bolton-flayed man on his sleeve. There was a woman whose mother had been a thrall in the Ironborn days, and who had a way of turning words like turning a skiff on a narrow river. There were Manderly men, one with a beard the shape of a storm and another, younger, looking as if he would rather be in his father's counting room, and ashamed of the fact. There were hill clansmen, silent as granite unless one of their own chose to speak. And there was Jaina Reed, who had come late to the yard and come earlier to this hall, and sat as if she could fold herself into the bench and vanish if need asked it. "White Harbor," Sansa said after Daena Manderly had done with the latest tally. "Speak to the ships." "The sea is where she's always been, Your Grace," Daena said without ornament. She was one of the needlewomen who had risen to House Manderly's trust in the winter when 10,000 hands were needed to sew 10,000 coats. Her hair was braided like rope, and she carried herself as if that rope held her together. But the south wind has been contrary, and the storm that pushed it over 2 days ago left 3 hulls on their knees. Lord Rhaegar is with the carpenters. And now, Brienne did not betray the jolt the name gave her. Rhaegar Manderly. She had been given a list of names until her ears had felt calloused. Each one came now like a dart thrown at a board. Some stuck, and some would have to be pulled and thrown again until they learned to stick. Not Rhaegar Targaryen, the ghosts were quick to say in her head. Not that song. "Grain?" Sansa asked. "Enough," Daena said. "If we cut the day by a third. Enough if we decide we care less for oats than for saltfish." "We will not," Sansa said quietly. "We will cut the day, and we will teach sauces." A sound went around the benches like a cough held back for courtesy. Brienne kept her face as blank as the pommel in her hand. Sansa's eyes flicked sideways to Davos. His mouth had made the shape of a smile, and then, at once, of a frown. "Sauces," he said as if tasting the word. "In White Harbor, we prefer butter. In my home, salt and pepper and courage. But I take your Gracie's meaning. Bestimmt. We will not allow the North to taste poor," Sansa said, "because that is a taste a people never forget. And one day they set their tongues against their rulers and bite. We will make the little meals good, we will make them ours, but we will not eat more than we have." Alysanne grunted approval, and the hill clansmen did not change their faces, which was how they showed they had not found fault. The letter from the Vale came when the tales of meat had ended, and the talk of the road to Barrowton had put two old men to drowsing gently at their benches. It came by the hand of a boy whose feet were blue with cold even beneath their wrappings. He had run with it from the bird tower where the raven had struck the slate with its wing, and he was proud and afraid. His name reached one of the scribes as he passed and lodged there like a coin. Sansa broke the white seal. No wax would hold in such weather. The end had been tied with thread, and read without changing her breath. "The Eyrie bids us good morning," she said at last, not without wryness, "and would know our intentions." "What intentions?" A man near the end of the table said. He had the look of a shepherd from the high moors, long arms and a face the sun had learned long ago. "There are so many to pick from, like plums." "The Vale is precise," Sansa said. "They mean, do we intend to stand, as we have declared, with the North for itself and the Riverlands under our hand, as they wish us, and will we accept their friendship, as well as their escort for trade? That is 3 questions and a snare," Davos said before anyone could speak. "The Vale do not nail a board with 1 nail where they can use 4. "Give me the letter," Brienne said without meaning to speak aloud. Sansa passed it without surprise. The vellum was ash dry and smelled faintly of the oil. Someone had rubbed into it to keep it from cracking in the cold. The hand was neat and thinner than a prim pen would like to be. She read through the careful turns of language and found the snare where Davos had pointed, and 2 more that no one had mentioned yet. One in a clause that made a simple market into a promise to restore a road across a border men had begun to forget existed. And one in a courtesy that named Sansa Queen, and then, in the line below, made that queen a ward of good neighbors. "They want to carry our grain in their wagons and write our weight on their scales," Brienne said. "And to call it friendship. They want us to accept that we have only one throat," Sansa said. "And if the throat is to be cut, it may as well be a clean cut. They want to see what sort of guard your Queensguard is," Alysanne added cheerfully. "Say yes to a wagon, and you say yes to a man on that wagon who can count your oats and your soldiers both." Sansa folded the letter along the crease, where it had been folded before, and slid it across the table to Ysana Reed. The Crannog woman held it and did not look down. Her eyes were the green of moss and shadow. "What do you think?" Sansa asked. "That men who live in the sky learn to walk as if they cannot be surprised," Gianna said. Her voice was low and water smooth. "If you decide to send a reply, send it in parts. Let one be brave, and one be polite, and one be slow. See which they answer first." Sansa gave the Reed woman a small nod, grateful and accustomed to the need to grow into the advice she hired. "We will send 3 letters," she said, "and we will count which is answered before we count their wagons." They turned the talk to closer matters. The watch had seen prints by the hunter's gate that were not wolf, not dog, not man. A priest from the little sept had asked to preach a blessing in the yard and been told no. He had left a note under the cook's door instead that promised to sweeten the stew, a kindness that would be used whether or not a prayer went over it. A rumor had come up from the kitchens like steam. The queen's sister had been seen in the village. The rumor had its own breath. It fogged the words of those who repeated it. Sansa let the mention pass across her face like the change of light when a cloud moves, and the hall understood there would be no answer to rumors in council. When the benches were emptying, Brienne lifted her cloak again, its weight already a habit, and moved toward the queen's chair. Sansa met her halfway. She did not drop her voice because a queen in the north who whispers too much invites men to lean close. "You read as well as you fight," Sansa said, quiet but not hissing. We have need of both. I am better at one than the other, Brienne said. But I have learned to mistrust men who claim to be good at their weaker hand. Sansa's mouth did something like a smile. There and gone. Not for anyone else. You have seen the yard. You have watched the hall. You have seen the faces that watch me when they think I am not looking. Choose me a second for your cloak, and 2 more for your guard. I would have 7 eventually, for the story of it. For now we will be 4. 4 is a number that knows it must make each one count. Menamd. Brienne thought of the faces she had watched while they watched her. There was a youth from the last hearth who moved without anger, and had not thought to show his strength until someone touched his sister's braid, and then he had put the man down with one hand. There was the White Harbor woman with the short swords whose poise would not desert her when blood made the ground slippery. There was a man from the watch who had come down with the dead and lived, and had not spoken in the yard, but whose back had known how to straighten at a command spoken without a shout. There was a free folk woman who had laughed at the cold as if it were a cocky suitor, with a scar at the hinge of her jaw like a question mark, grown tired of its own surprise. I will speak to them, Brienne said. I will not make anyone a shield who does not understand the weight of it. I have learned what happens when a vow is a hope instead of a nail. Choose the nails, Sansa said. Outside, the sky had gone the kind of pale that makes a woman squint, unsure if it promises more snow or a day. Brienne found Podrick near the stables, talking with a farrier whose wrists were corded and whose apron told the tale of 3 shoes pulled hot. Podrick was asking about the old forges under the smithy and how the draft ran up in a crosswind. He had a way with people who knew the work of their hands that made them tell him things not because he was clever, though he often was, but because he did not pretend at not being ignorant. Podrick saw Brienne and shut his mouth mid-word. Horses are never so foolish as men think they are, Brienne said, and the farrier, whose name Podrick would give her later, and she would turn over in her head until it stayed, laughed, and the sound made the cold seem thinner. I thought, Podrick said when the farrier had gone back to his forge. The red glow under the eaves like a secret fire. You might want the weight of the cloak changed. It tugs at your right shoulder when you turn in. I noticed, Brienne said. You have a good eye. You taught me it, he said, and then added, Your Grace asked for nails. So she did. They found the first nail in the yard an hour later, when the youth from the last hearth stepped between 2 men with a speed that could have been foolishness, but was not. The men had been arguing about a dice game from 3 nights past and a woman named Mira, who had been wise enough to keep both her silence and her shoes, and the argument's heat had made their fingers dumb. The youth put his hand on one man's wrist and walked him 3 steps away without making a show of it. Brienne watched how he did not raise his voice and how his eyes did not flick to the witnesses in the yard to see if they had seen him save face. What is your name? She asked him when the men had turned their backs to each other like dogs agreeing not to fight. Gren, he said, and she could not help the shadow of a wince because the name carried ghosts. Gren of Umber blood, though my mother says blood is only a map. Do you want to stand between the Queen and trouble? Brienne asked. I've stood between my sister and trouble most of my life, he said frankly. I don't know if Queen's trouble is different. It is louder, Brienne said, and it takes longer to die. But it bleeds the same on your boots. Gren looked at her, and then at the cloak, and then at the sword. I can be taught, he said. He did not add quickly. She liked him better for the lack. The White Harbor woman was called Sarah Bonds. And if that was not her first or last name, Brienne did not ask. Because there are names you pull at and names you leave to sit in the snow and keep their warmth. Sarah fought with short swords because a long one had once been taken from her by a man who thought he deserved it, and since that day she had preferred weapons no man could pry clean away without having his fingers broken 2 by 2. Brienne watched her move and saw the economy. My queen needs someone who can turn 3 men into 2, Brienne said. I'm better at turning 2 into 1. But I can practice. The man from the watch had a face like a cairn. stones set one atop another to keep a grave from opening even when the ground shifted. He wore a strip of black at his arm in the way many did who had come down after the long night with nowhere to go. And he worked without complaint at tasks. Men refused because they had once been soldiers, and soldiers had pride. He spoke his name as if saying it kept something else from speaking through him. Harith, he said. The word sounded like the groan of a cedar bending in a gale. You used to watch a wall, Brienne said. Would you watch a woman instead? Harith looked at her a long time. Walls do not bleed, he said. They crack, she said. Women crack too sometimes. And then they hold. Mendi. I will watch, he said at last, and she saw in his eyes that he had wanted to be asked. The free folk woman found Brienne before Brienne found her. She sauntered into the stable where Brienne was checking the bite of a bit on a mare that had been snapping because her mouth had blooded, and touched Oathkeeper's hilt with the reverence of a thief not quite willing to steal from a shrine. Her hair was the color of straw on a riverbank after flood, and her eyes were sea gray, and the scar at her jaw asked questions Brienne had also asked herself. They call me Ragna, she said. If you want my other name, you can drag it out of me, but you'll have to do it with your hands and not your sword, and most people prefer not to touch me when they have a choice. I have learned to prefer the truth under the name, Brienne said. Do you want to carry a queen's life over your shoulder like a yoke? I've carried my son's, Ragna said, unblinking. He lived. The man who tried to gut him did not. Brienne looked at the way she stood. Feet set as if on a deck, knees soft, hips loose. The habit of watching for waves. The one who could not gut him, Brienne said. How did he die? Angry, Ragna said, and let herself grin just enough that they both knew she had told a joke and meant it. By midday, the nails had names. Podrick wrote them down with his gloved hand because he had taken it upon himself to be the ledger of Brienne's thoughts in ink when her thoughts had to be spent on steel. The ink thickened in the cold, and he warmed his pen in his mouth between words and made faces he tried not to let her see. He looked at her now and then with pride. He did not know how to trim. Brienne bore the look the way she bore the cloak. Grateful, conscious of its weight, unwilling to shrug it off. The afternoon gathered itself into color and breath. Sansa walked the battlements because her people took comfort from the sight of their queen beside the crenels. Scarf to her eyes, hair a strip of fire when the wind lifted. She never made a show of speaking to men she did not know, and she always stopped when a child waved. Brienne watched the walkers and the watchers both. The gate stood open not in welcome, but because Winterfell did not hide from the day. There were eyes enough to measure who came and who went without metal in the hinges. It was there, on the low stretch of wall above the Hunter's Gate, that Brienne first saw the singer. He was dressed badly to be remarkable and badly, because he did not know better. Southerners came north with silk under their wool, as if they thought the cold could be tricked. His neck scarf had been dyed a blue that small folk would call a king's ransom, and noble women would call too obvious. His boots had been soft at one point and were stiff now. He carried the small harp in a sack that had once been used for oats. He's got the wrong strings, Ragna said at Brienne's shoulder, a little amazed. Listen. The man had set himself perpendicular to the wind, as if he had learned that much. His fingers picked at the harp, and the sound came out thin and wooden at first, then found a little fat on it as he adjusted. He had a good voice. He had the kind of good voice that is more dangerous than great voices, because the ear trusts it, and a too smooth lie has a burr. The truth can catch on. Will you send him away? Podrick asked, a trifle anxious, because he hated to see any man turn from a warm place. Not yet, Brienne said. She watched the singer watch the queen, as many men did, and saw that he did not stare the way Southerners did when they thought they were seeing a tale. He looked the way men look at a door that might open. Your Grace, Brienne said softly, stepping closer. Sansa did not turn her head, only let her breath quiver in the scarf so Brienne knew she had heard. The man with the harp. I see him, Sansa said. Her lashes had caught snow and made it jewel light. His scarf is ridiculous. It may have been meant to catch your eye. Then it has failed, Sansa said. Because I have eaten bluer things in my life and lived. Let him play. If he sings of chivalry, I will come down. If he sings of home, I will keep walking. He sang of neither. He sang of rivers and markets, and the taste of apples, sour enough to make a mouth feel new. Brienne hung back and watched how the singer's case caught coins. Not many coins. Enough that a man might continue, and not enough that he would grow careless. A boy from the kitchens brought him a cup of something that steamed, and he bowed over it, as if humility could heat fingers. Ragna uncoiled and drifted down to stand where the gate's shadow sheltered the form of a poor man without dignity. She watched as if looking at her reflection in water. By dusk, the singer's scarf had frozen at its edges. He sang himself a place by the fire not by his voice, but because Sansa, having heard him sing of apples, and not of queens, decided to tell the hall that a traveling man should not lose his fingers in a realm that would call itself hers. He stood by the lowest fire, warming himself without asking too much. A man who had learned to eat slowly what was given. "Your Grace," Brienne said when the evening had gone far enough that the singer's eyelids had begun to stick for want of sleep. "Yes," Sansa said, and the word carried all the weariness that came when a queen had given the day all of herself and found that the day did not apologize for demanding more. "I will walk the lower corridors," Brienne said. "The old ways under the west tower. The iron stair." Sansa nodded. "Do not do it alone." "I never do," Brienne said, meaning the sword at her hip and the oath in her mouth and the thought of a woman who had not lived to see this room. She took Podrick, because he moved quietly now, and Harith, because silence is a different quiet, and Jaina Reed, because a woman who can vanish in a hall can find a man who thinks the hall will hide him. They moved through corridors older than recollection and newer than myth. Winterfell had been built like a braid, strands crossing and recrossing around a center you could not see. The stones held heat where the hot springs ran beneath. In places the walls breathed a mist that made frost on eyelashes and warmed cheeks at once. Torches flared as they passed and then folded into themselves with little gasps. The old iron stair went down into air that smelled of wet metal. Brienne's hand on the rail came away stained with brown. Once, long ago, she had lived in a castle by the sea where metal was a thing that turned red if ignored. In the north even disuse had its beauty. They descended to a passage whose ceiling was low enough to force Brienne to bow her head, and then to a door that had been wedged with a sliver of wood worn smooth by generations of fingers that did not like to be watched while they came and went. Anna touched the wedge with 2 fingers and then lifted her hand and smelled them. "Fish," she said. "White Harbor," Podrick guessed. "Or the river," Yana said. "Or a man who ate his supper with his hands." They left the wedge as it was. The door creaked. Harith moved through first, shoulders hunched as if braced against an imagined blow. The passage beyond was a throat with 20 voices, the sounds of the castle talking in itself. Drips, footsteps, a murmur of laughter that could have been water. They passed alcoves where the light found old marks cut into stone, lines that made no words, and the round imprints that told where barrels had rested out seasons. Brienne felt the hair prickle at the back of her neck, not with fear but with the knowledge of being in a place that was not indifferent to her. "What do we look for?" Podrick whispered, because it felt wrong to speak aloud. "The thing that doesn't belong?" Brienne said. "What if it's us?" he asked without thinking, and then colored and wished to snatch the words back. "Then we learn it and make it belong," she said. "Or we change it." They found nothing to take back to the queen and say, "Look." They found the places where a woman could wait and watch without being seen, and they counted them. Brienne marked a turning with her mind. Left here, then right where the stones grew damp, then a door that sighed like an old dog, so that no shadow could surprise her later by remembering a path she had not learned. Harith stopped only once, to put his hand on a stone that had cracked. "This is new," he said, and Brienne trusted him because he knew what old looked like. "The cold went down here yesterday." They came up at last by the warm set of steps near the kitchens, and a girl in flour to the elbows darted in front of Brienne with a tray of pies, and Brienne stepped back like a soldier from a bolt, and then smiled at herself for it. The smell was of cinnamon and fat. Podrick found one crust cooling in the dark, and looked at Brienne with a boy's grief when she shook her head. He did not sigh, which made her laugh and clap his shoulder. "You are learning," she said. By night, the hall had learned to be loud after a day of being hushed around snow. The singer had found a place not at the high table, but not far from it. A place where his songs could travel upward without presumption. Sansa ate a little, and then less. She had learned not to be seen to refuse food when her people measured their meals, just as she had learned to let them see her take only one portion. Davos leaned close once and said something that made her eyes soften. Maester Walken had the weary dignity of a man who knows his lists will outlast him. Elizan had her boots on a bench and did not apologize to anyone for the wet they left. Jaina Reed ate with small, neat bites and watched the doors. The song the man chose to sing then was not about queens or apples or chivalry. It was about doors long shut and doors that opened the wrong way, letting winter in. Brienne saw Sansa's hand still on her cup. The song was a good song. Good songs were sometimes knives. His chords, Ragna said in Brienne's ear, are southern. His scarf is too, Brienne answered. And my queen is learning to be north. What would you have me do? Watch his hands, Brienne said. Not for poison, for nerves. A careful liar forgets less in his fingers than in his mouth. Then now, Ragna watched. A man who is welcome doesn't move his ring so much, she murmured. Or maybe he's new wed, but I don't think so. Brienne considered how to ask for his story and get a true one. She did not yet have the gift Sansa had to make a man pour himself into a cup just by holding it out. She had a sword and a cloak and a face that made liars nervous and honest men braver than they should be. There were uses for all of those. When the song ended, before the clamor could become a request for another, Brienne stood and crossed to him. Silence finds tall women. She did not seek it. It arrived. You are far from your road, she said. Very few minstrels choose the hunter's gate unless they are chased by debts or by weather. Debt is a kind of weather. The man said, and Brienne allowed the answer. It was not the worst she had heard, and he spoke it without the flinch of a liar trapped in his own tale. Up close she could smell the clean of snow on his clothes, and the old scent of smoke that never leaves a garment traveling town to town. His eyes were green, not birthright green like the children of the neck, but the green of a leaf in shade, an eye that watches for storms. Your name, Brienne said. Orin, he said. Of King's Landing. He watched her when he said it. He did not blink. You walked, Brienne said. You did not come with a caravan. The caravans carry grain and armaments and men with sharper arms, Orin said lightly. They leave no room for songs. Sometimes songs leave room for messages, Brienne said. She had not raised her voice, and yet the line of men 4 places down the table had heard. Their shoulders had stiffened. Sometimes, Orin said, his mouth turning as if to a new stanza, the message is only that a place has a queen who can afford to feed a man for a song that is neither flattering nor false. Do you know many queens? Brienne asked. I know the kinds of men who prefer to keep them, Orin said. And I know the kinds of doors that queens must watch. Your doors are older than mine. That is why I sang of them. No. Brienne looked at his hands. The ring he worried on his finger had the look of something won rather than given. The band was not sized to him and had cut a faint groove into skin, either too fat last winter or too lean this one. The knuckles had 2 small scars where a lute string had whipped him. She had seen such marks on men with music more often than on men with knives. He did not smell of lies. He smelled of cold and bread crust, and something like river clay. She thought of Yana saying fish. If you have a message for the queen, Brienne said, give it to me and I will decide if she should hear it while she eats. I have a song for the steward, Orin said, almost smiling. It lists the cast of a troop that intends to pass through the neck, and the number of wagons they travel with, and the oddity of their mule having a scar on its right shoulder, an inch from the yoke. That is a strange song, Podrick said behind her, startled into being heard. It has a good tune, Orin promised, and a refrain that asks why men pretending to be clowns wear boots with nails cut to mimic the sound of a cart. Because the road listens, and because boots are easier to change than wagons. Brienne did not look toward Sansa. She did not want Oren to see where her eyes went when her mind moved. "You will sing this tune for the steward," she said. "And the steward will see if the maester's ear finds it music. And if it does not," Oren asked. "Then you will sing of apples," Brienne said. "And you will sleep with both hands where my guard can see them." He bowed with a southern grace small enough to fit inside the North's patience, and did not attempt to catch Sansa's eye again. That was also information. Brienne let Podrick lead the man to the steward's alcove. Podrick had learned to look unthreatening in ways Brienne never would, and stood without moving and watched the hall breathe. The night thinned. Men went away under their cloaks like tents falling. The stories told went from war to wives to weather, and then to the small tyranny of a sore tooth that kept a good man from sleep. Sansa left with Maester Wolkan and Davos walking a pace behind, a path opening itself through the press as water finds its course. Brienne followed with Podrick at her shoulder. Ragnar peeled away to the gate, and Hareth went down to the lower corridor again, as if the dark would be comforted to discover it had not been ignored. Lyanna vanished without fanfare as if she had never been there. In the Queen's chamber, the fire had been built to last the night, wood banked to burn without noise. The room carried the smell of wool drying in rose oil and parchment. Brienne would never stop the jolt of seeing Sansa without her cloak. Winterfell had made a queen of furs and iron and then, in private, returned a daughter to herself. Sansa sat by the hearth and warmed her hands not greedily. Her hair unbraided made a ribbon on her shoulder. It would be braided again in the morning, because winter respects habits. "Did you hear the song?" she asked, and the question was to both Brienne and Podrick. "Part," Brienne said. "Enough to know that a mule with a scar may be a cart with eyes. If men pass through the neck with nails in their boots to pretend at being wagons," Sansa said, "they may pass messages I would prefer to intercept." "Lyanna will drink the marsh with them if she chooses," Brienne said. "She will find where the nails make the ground angry." Sansa looked at her then, and Brienne saw, as she had seen sometimes when she had been small and terrible and brave, the grief that would never be anyone else's business. "Do you ever wish to lay down your sword?" Sansa asked. She asked it, not because she was unsure of the answer, but because she wanted to hear which words Brienne would put around it. "I sometimes wish to be a person without edges," Brienne said, thinking. "I know I am not that person." "You are kind," Sansa said, as if contradicting no one but the room. "Kindness has edges when it is used as a blade." Brienne thought of the cloak, its weight a comfort on her shoulders. She had known kindness as a girl. A father who had not laughed. A maid who had sewn her bodices without words that made her cheeks burn. And she had known kindness as a woman. An old man who had offered his blanket to a stranger. A boy who had followed her through a country that did not want him. She had learned that kindness often had to be held before it would grow hard enough to be useful. "I will walk the walls 2 hours past midnight," Brienne said, because questions such as the one Sansa had asked could make two women linger inside them too long and leave the outer world unguarded. "I will sleep," Sansa said, "and I will not apologize to the hall for doing so." Brienne bowed. She moved to the door and waited. Sansa stood and laid her hand on Brienne's forearm for the space of a breath. There were gloves and wool between them, and yet the touch was warm. Brienne knew a blessing when she felt one, and did not pretend it was anything else. The castle at night is not the castle by day. Winterfell's stones had different faces in darkness. The banners in the great hall moved like breathing beasts. In a quiet passage near the armory, Brienne found a glove on the floor. It had not been there at dusk. It was made of kidskin and lined with fox, and there was a thread at the hem that had come loose but not fallen. Brienne held it to her face and smelled soap and the faintest ghost of something that reminded her of a market by a river on a day when oranges had come on a ship. She folded the glove in her hand and kept walking, because you do not stop for every glove. Later she would give it to the steward, and later still, he would tell her it belonged to a woman who had washed dishes for 3 weeks and left without collecting her pay. You learn to put a pin in such details and string them on a thread, only when you had enough to make a shape. Near the Godswood Gate, the snow had drifted in heavy shoulders that would need to be cut back in the morning. The heart tree stood unmoved. a red shape against a world eager to be white. Brienne stood at the edge where the path allowed the living to look and felt the certainty that had come to her their earlier return with a different strangeness. The face in the tree looked about nothing and everything at once. The old gods had the patience to watch a life top to bottom. Brienne did not. She had the patience to watch a door until a man came through it who should not have. A raven flapped up from the branches and dropped a small clump of snow that fell against Brienne's shoulder and made the cloak darker where it melted. She did not look up. The raven made the sound ravens make when they are amused or hungry or cold. It is the same sound, and then was gone back to whatever work the night pressed on it. When she turned back toward the walls, she saw a figure where no figure had been a moment before, at the far end of the yard. It was not how the figure moved that set the rope in her spine thrumming. It was how the figure stood. Men who belonged in a place stand as if they can turn their heads without moving their feet. Men who do not belong stand as if every step is a lie that must be rehearsed. The figure rehearsed a step, then took it. "Pod," Brienne said. She had not heard him move, but he was there, as he always was when he said he would be. Like a second breath. The far end. "Walk, don't run." Podrick walked. The figure walked too. The far end opened into a passage under an arch, and turned left. Then left again. Then down the stair that led to the door with the wedge and the smell of fish. Brienne let the figure show her that he knew the way. Then she followed. Not fast, not slow. At the door, the wedge had been taken up and set aside and put back. Exactly as it had been before. That was the kind of care that tells a woman how to take care of her queen. "Jaina," Brienne said, and the Crannog woman unpeeled from the shadow of the opposite wall as if she had been grown there. "Boots," Jaina whispered. "Nails." "Orin's song has a chorus," Brienne said. They went down. They would not find a man with a knife and a letter in the same pocket. They would find 3 footprints where there should have been 2, and a mark on a barrel where a ring had scratched wood, and a hair caught in a splinter that did not belong to a man or a woman of the north. They would find the place where the passage breathed warmer, because a door had been opened under the earth that had not been opened in many winters. They would come up at dawn with nothing to show Sansa but the list of what the darkness had told them, and the certainty that the castle's lungs had learned a new breath. Brienne would sleep no more than 2 hours with her boots at the foot of her bed and her sword across 2 stools, where she could reach it in one motion. She would dream of waves crossing a winter sea, boats pulled up into a cove 2 nights before a storm, men with boots that lied in their own quiet rhythm. She would wake to bells. Small, the kitchens calling a day, and to Podrick's light knock. Twice, then once, because he had learned to knock like a person who knows his news may be either poison or bread. And when she crossed the yard with the gray cloak on her shoulders, and the red leaves stitched into its hem, catching the light, the way a bruise catches the eye, men would stand a fraction straighter, and women would tip their faces to measure the weather, and the singer would be there again, with a different song. The song would be about wolves who learned to ride the river on ice, and it would pretend to be about winter, and it would not be only about winter. There would be a letter from the Riverlands with mud still on it when the raven arrived. There would be a fight near the hunter's gate that would break 2 teeth and prove 2 men friends. There would be decisions to weigh like stones and a queen who knew the weight of each. Brienne of Tarth, Lady Commander of the Queensguard of the North, would stand with Oathkeeper's ruby dark steel at her hip and the knowledge of failure and of promise in her bones. She would count doors and faces and breaths. She would choose nails. She would teach her little guard the correct rhythm of a palace that had grown up like a forest, twisting, patient, alive. She would walk in the shadow of a heart tree that watched her without judgment, and remember that vows are not winds. They are walls you build, and then bear until the day they do their work. And in a week, not quite yet, when the wagons with too few nails came north and the troop of players who were not players made the mistake of making one child laugh whom they should have let alone, Brienne would be in the yard before they knew they had been seen. Ragna would be at her shoulder with her scar asking questions for both of them. Hareth would lean his weight against a door under the earth until it decided to remember how to be shut. Yana would be a rumor that frightened rats. Podrick would do one brave, Foolish thing. And then 2 clever ones. Sarah Bonds would turn 2 men into 1. Gren would put his hand on a wrist and walk a man 3 steps away, and then a 4th, and then into a cell where he would not be able to melt into the cracks in the stone. But that would be later. For now, there was snow, and the breath of a queen in the cold, and the old gods looking through their leaves as if it pleased them to see a pattern begin. For now, there was a cloak to learn, and a hall to read, and a psalm to decide what to do with. For now, there was a tall woman walking the yard with the quiet of someone who has decided that whatever breaks next will break where she stands and nowhere else. For now, the North watched her, and found something it had not expected to find, and took comfort from the finding, and did not say so aloud. Ya. K. Ka. The troop found Wintertown on a freeze-thaw morning that made the ruts in the King's Road the color and shape of scars. The roofs wore old snow. The chimneys gave up smoke unwillingly, and the sound of the river beneath its lid was a low, patient note. Men came out of houses with their cloaks already on. Women watched under door lintels with their hands tucked into aprons. Children did what children always do, ran close enough to see, and then farther than anyone thought they would. The first wagon was painted in tired colors. The cold had bitten dull. The second was not painted at all, but wore a fringe of faded cloth along its rail, as if it had been dressed in a hurry. The third wobbled on a wheel that had learned to wobble long ago and taken pride in it since. Count the nails, Jaina said under her breath at Brienne's side, and the words were the chorus of Orin's psalm now that they had work to do. Brienne did not need to kneel to see them. When a wheel turns on a day as cold as this, the nails make a sound that is not quite like any other thing. A small, truthful tap inside the music of wood. The first cart said, 15. The second said, 9. The third said, 10. Then, after a small pause where the wheel slurred, 8. She felt the weight of Oathkeeper at her hip and did not touch it. Ragna beside her had already counted the feet as well. The men with boots on the ground and the men who hid their boots upon the beds of the wagons, as if boots could be hidden when a woman had learned to listen to them. They want the gate, Ragna said. They want to see how we open it. We will open it slowly, Brienne said. We will open it as if we have always opened it slowly. The guards at the Hunter's Gate had been told to be courteous to mummers with frozen hands and suspicious of men who laughed too loudly. They lifted the bar and made a show of rubbing their fingers afterward, and Brienne watched to see which of the new men watched them back. One, with a jaw like a cleaver and eyes that did not belong to a fool, counted under his breath with his fingers in his pockets. Brienne filed his face where she kept faces that would one day be told to stand against a wall. The second was a boy with a lip too smooth for his beard, who made the mistake of looking up at the murder holes, as if a play might be performed there. The third had a blank space where fear belongs. Brienne had learned that blankness often meant a man thought he could afford to be afraid later. The troopmaster had a cap with 3 bells and a voice like butter going into a cold pan. "Good men of Wintertown," he called with a practiced chafe of his throat, "and good women with better purses, we bring warmth to your eyes and laughter to your ribs, and a tale that will make you forget you have toes. We will take shelter by the wall while we wheedle your queen into letting us freeze in her hall for your amusement." "No one freezes in my hall," Sansa had said the night before when Brienne had set out the plan. "Not even liars. Let them freeze outside. Then bring them in, because I do not teach my people to be proud of cruelty." "Then shall." Now the troopmaster jumped down off the wagon with the care of a man who knows how high his own bones sit inside him. He bowed very low to no one in particular, and very near to Brienne by accident. She looked at his hands when he came up. They were calloused in the right places for a man who juggles knives, and the wrong places for a man who works rope. He had the kind of face that lets small folk forget themselves enough to laugh in front of a lord. "Sir," he said, uncertain if the word would fit her. "Lady," he corrected at once, with a gambler's grin. "Commander," he added, because the cloak told him to be careful. "Might we ask?" "You will set your wagons there," Brienne said, pointing to the place where the cold ground had kept itself smooth. "The men with the green scarves will help you unhitch." No man in the troop wore a green scarf. 3 of Brienne's own did. Gren was one. His scarf hid the lower part of his face and made him look younger than he was, which could be a kind of trap. Sarah Bonds wore no scarf and had never been asked to. She moved through groups as if she were the seam they made. Harith was nowhere to be seen, which meant he was standing where every man who mattered had already stepped past him without noticing. Ragna had a little frost on her lashes and did not blink it away. They worked the troop like dough, pressing here and then there to see where the air was. One man made too much noise about a coil of rope, as if he feared it. Brienne followed the noise to the place in the second wagon where the false bottom had been fitted by a carpenter, who had been honest about the wood and dishonest about the purpose. She did not lift it in front of them. She nodded to Podrick, and Podrick found a reason to lead the wagon aside in the direction of the steward's yard, where the ground was harder and the eyes were fewer. The troop performed in the square because that is what a town is for when it is not feeding goats. They juggled, and they played a bear who was a man, and a man who was a bear, and they sang a rude thing about onions that made Davos' mouth twitch and then go straight again. The boy with the smooth lip took a fall that would have broken the head of another boy and bounced up to take another. He had learned to be made of rope. The troop master's bells made noise only when he chose. That was the mark of a man who understood when to be seen and when to be unheard. Sansa watched from a short distance, with two old women from the town standing just behind her and criticizing the costumes as if they had been asked for counsel on fabric. She did not smile openly. She let herself be seen, and she measured how men measured her. Brienne watched from the angle that allowed her to see Sansa and the troop in the same turn of her head without moving her feet. Jaina was not in the square at all. She was everywhere the square wasn't, and later she would tell Brienne where the nails went, when the wagon's wheels were lifted off the ground for a moment to let a boy catch a forgotten prop. When the performance had bought the troop warmth, Brienne led it. They were led, not to the great hall, but to the broad, low room near the buttery where lamplight warmed stone without making it boastful. They were given bowls of stew and bread that fought back, and beer that did not. The troop master flicked his eyes only once toward the corridor that led to the old iron stair. Harith was standing in that corridor, in the way a closed door stands, simply present, and therefore effective. Brienne waited until the second bowl was half eaten. Men feel strongest after a first bowl, clever after a second, sleepy after a third. She wanted them clever and not strong. She set her palm on the false bottom of the second wagon in front of the troop master, without taking her eyes from his mouth. He did not lick his lips. He did not look at the thing he had hidden. He looked at her hand. "Some men," Brienne said, almost conversationally, as Davos and Hallis and Alysanne and the steward arranged themselves as walls in a room shallower than it looked, "make a show of barrels to hide a blade. Some men use apples, you used a stage." "We are a stage, my lady," the troop master said, and with too much cheer, or a poor imitation of one. "We are what a town wants to see until it wants to see something else." "Then show what I want to see," Sansa said from the doorway, and her voice went through the room without stepping on anyone's foot. "Is what you carry for the men who put nails in your boots to make the road think you are a wagon." The troop master went very still then, as if stillness could be an answer. Behind him, the boy with the smooth lip made his hand into a fist under the table. Sirah, who had been watching only the boy's hands, saw it and put her knife gently onto the wood beside his bowl, as if she were reminding him of the existence of cutlery. Brienne lifted the false bottom. There were no blades. There were ribbons and grease sticks for painting faces, and a ledger bound in oilcloth with the cover made to look careless about which side was front and which was back. There was a small chest for coins and a bigger one for props. There was a cloth packet tied with a piece of blue thread. Brienne put the ledger aside and picked up the packet, feeling its shape before she undid it. Inside, wrapped as if the notion of breaking them would shame a man, were 6 small plates of pewter stamped with the sigil of a tree she knew too well. The greenwood, in a southern hand that had not understood that the old name was only that, and that men did not call it Mirkwood in the north, because the word did not belong to their tongue. At the center of each plate was an iron disc the size of a ring, and on each disc there was a notch cut in a different place. Davos made a low sound. "Wagons," he said. Scales? Sansa said at the same time. The troop master did not flinch when they looked at him. He was wise enough to know that flinching serves only when a lash is already in motion. We were paid to carry those plates to the place where the weights of wheat are counted, he said. We did not ask their purpose. You did not have to, Brienne said. You have weighed enough turns of your own tricks to know the weight of iron. The man with the cleaver jaw, who had not made himself a fool in the square, watched Sansa when he thought no one watched him. Brienne, who had been taught by years to move her gaze without moving her head, watched him back. The notch in one of the discs would make a scale sit a small fraction off on a day when men were too cold to fight over a handful of oats. A small fraction of many measures makes an empty warehouse in a slow winter. Who gave them? Sansa said, is a question my steward will ask you. Who receives them is a question my steward will answer for me. None. We will not hang mummers for a trick that merchants perfected before the first snow, Diana Manderly said dryly from the doorway. She had come quiet as a thread and stood with her arms folded as if ready to cut cloth. We will hang a merchant later when his name is written in a ledger he thinks is clean. Brienne set the discs one by one on the table and watched the boy with the smooth lip watch them. He was counting backwards. He would be good to turn if he could be turned. Boys often are. Sarah lifted the ledger, turned it the wrong way and then the right way, and nodded when she found the sewed-in scrap that told her which side the writer thought should be up. It is written by two hands, she said without looking up. One who has learned to copy a clerk and one who made his letters in a moving wagon. The clerk's hand writes the weights, Davos said, leaning over. The wagon's writes the towns. They wanted us to be satisfied with the clerk, Brienne said. We will not be. Sansa stepped into the room the rest of the way. E8, she told the troop master. You will not be dragged half-fed, and you will not be questioned while you hold a spoon. Then you will tell my steward who gave you pewter, and where you were told to take it. You will give him the names you can. The boy will speak to Sir Brienne, because Sir Brienne wants to know why boys choose wolves' teeth over their own. Men who lie will be held, and then punished. Men who tell the truth and are fools will pay a fine and go south and not return. I do not turn Winterfell into a place that kills men for wanting to live another month unless they attempt to make the North starve to do so. Da. The troop master dropped his eyes to his bowl and ate, and at last he looked like a man who had been cold for a long time and was ready to pay whatever coin he had to pay to be warm for a while. The boy stole glances at Brienne as boys do, who think they will be asked to join a story without dreaming they will be allowed. She sat across from him and let him see her see him. What do you call yourself? She asked in a tone that carried no weight at all. Lem, he said, and then he grimaced because it was a name at once too common and too pointed. There had been another Lemon Tails, with a lemon cloak and no patience for fools. Lem Low, he added, as if making it worse would make it unremarkable. Where did you learn to fall like that? In a place where falling is cheaper than learning to hit, he said, sullen only because he was ashamed to find himself speaking so easily. The Riverlands. On the green, when the carts come. Nen Shao. Who taught you to write your letters? My mother, he said, when she had them. Then a man who liked to look at his own hand and wanted someone to tell him it was pretty. You have a choice, Brienne said softly. You can be a man who writes his own letters, or a man who counts someone else's nails until his mouth is too cold to say numbers. If you choose the first, I will see that you are not thrown into the snow the day after you make your mouth say the wrong name. He looked at her, trying to find the trick in what she had said. Finding none, he let his shoulders sag and his spoon make a sound in the bowl like relief. What is in the third wagon? She asked then, and his eyes went to the troop master without meaning to. Only props, he said, and then, catching his own mistake, and a cloak. What cloak? A red one, he said, trying too hard to be casual. For a queen. The room tightened without moving a muscle. Sansa's face did not change. Davos, who had his own history with false colors, turned his head very slightly as if to watch the door and the window at the same time. Alisanne's fingers made a soft drumming on her own elbow. "Bring me the cloak," Sansa said to Brienne, and the words carried like a plank. Brienne took Podrick and Gren, and did not take Sira because Sira's face still held more of the river than of the snow, and she did not want the wagon's contents to fit any tale the troopmaster might later try to spin. The cloak, when they found it, was wrapped in cloth that had been kept dry even on a road that had not been kind to dry things. It was red enough to make a man think of a Tully trout by firelight. It was embroidered with little leaves in thread that had flaked at the edges, and when Brienne shook it open, she saw that the inside had been lined with wool carded to feel more costly than it was. It was, in short, a prop, but it was also a shape meant to fit around a woman like Sansa Tarth. "Who ordered it made?" she asked Lem when they brought it back to the long room. "I don't know," he said, and then, seeing her face, "I don't. He came to our camp by the river. He wore a scarf over his mouth and had a cough and spoke as if his teeth hurt. He gave us coin in the plates, and he told us what to sing and told us to show the cloak to a woman in a blue dress near the wall at White Harbor and tell her that the roll was ready." "Bendas Daena?" Sansa asked, and Daena's mouth did a thing that counted as surprise. A woman in a blue dress near the wall at the harbor could be any of 500 needlewives, Daena said dryly. "And I do not believe myself so easily mistaken for a fool. But I have cousins with fools among them." "It is bait," Davos said, and the word was so undramatic in his mouth that no one could mistake his meaning. "Not for the fishwives. For us. The roll is ready," Sansa repeated. "They meant to see who among my people would take the cloak and then to follow it. And when the cloak did not lead them to a woman with red hair, it would lead them to someone else. They thought close enough. Or they would make a scene with it if it pleased them. Or they would throw it," Alisanne said cheerfully, "and call it a wedding thing in the square, and watch who cried. It would be a cruel trick in a place that has had enough of cruelty." Sansa reached out and touched the red cloth with one gloved finger. "Keep it," she said to Brienne. "We will give it to the weaver's widow. She will cut it into 20 mufflers and sell them cheap and let everyone know where the cloth came from. Make a lesson of it. And then we will send a cloak of our own to the place by the harbor and see who bites it." Men who had expected gallows and gibbets went white, and then slowly took color again as their blood remembered where to go. Brienne watched the troopmaster watching Sansa and saw understanding there that had nothing to do with plots or letters. He was learning that this queen would lay the weight of punishment and the weight of mercy on the same scale and make them sit level enough to teach a town not to stare when a man is beaten, because the lesson is memorized better when you don't have to watch the blow. They went on with their day. It is a thing the North is very good at, going on. Sansa sent 3 letters to the Vale as she had promised. One that was brave and spoke of roads as if they were bones. One that was polite and asked for spice. One that was slow and asked nothing at all for 3 pages. Davos watched the scribe make the shapes and said nothing until the sand blew off the second, and he saw that the polite letter had earned itself more flourishes than he liked. Then he coughed, and the scribe cut his quill shorter. The Riverlands letter that had come at dusk had been from a steward at River Run, whose name looked like a knot. Harris or Harros, with a hand that made its own loops and assumed your eye would learn them. It spoke of the roads near Acorn Hall, of bandits who had once been levies, and of levies who were pretending to be bandits because their lords had forgotten to pay them. It did not ask for soldiers from Winterfell, and did not name Edmure, because men in the Riverlands had learned that names could be used as traps. It asked if the Queen in the North would be offended if a band of men who have more boots than sense asked to warm their feet at her fires when they come farther north than the twins. They want to see if the North will pretend the trident is a fence, Davos said. Or if it is a road. We will not pretend, Sansa said, that any river is a fence, especially in winter. But we will not pretend to be steward to a land that has not asked for our hand. We will send advice, and perhaps some salt pork, and we will send it under my seal, and we will watch who reads it before it is opened. Then, Brienne spent her hours where a commander must, half in the yard, half under stone. She put Gren and Lem together with wooden swords because boys of a certain age teach each other without meaning to. Lem had the lightness of a tumbler and the bad habit of letting his wrists go soft when he tired. Gren had the strength in his forearms that comes from lifting sacks by the mouth of the bag, and boys too small to lift their own feet out of snow. Hit him where he thinks he is clever, Brienne told Lem, not unkindly. Mend of that mistake before any other. Don't watch his blade. She told Gren, watch his shoulder. The blade is where the lie is. The shoulder tells the truth. They took the words in and made them into movement, which is the only way such words live. Sarah Bonds taught the guard the dance of short blades at close quarters in the old washroom, where the flagstones had been made slick by years of soap. If you can hold your feet on this, she told them, you can hold them anywhere. She tapped ankles with the flat to remind a man where his weight had gone when he wasn't listening. She turned Gren's habit of planting his heels into a way of deciding fights against men who came heavy. She showed Podrick a trick with his left hand that made a man look at the wrong place for the pain. Podrick beamed at her like a boy with a berry, and then, when she wasn't looking, practiced it twice with the empty air with seriousness that made Brienne's chest ache for reasons she did not examine. Harith did not teach men to move. He taught them to be still. He showed them how to listen for the difference between a door that complains, because it is old, and a door that is trying not to complain, because someone has oiled it for a reason. He taught them how long a candle burns when the draft is doing a certain thing under a floor. He stood in the dark with them and waited, while their breathing found a rhythm that iron likes. And then he said, "There," and asked them to tell him what the corridor had said in its sleep. Most men thought him a little mad for a week. Then they began to hear the things he heard, and felt their skin crawl with knowledge they had wanted to think was a story told to frighten new hall boys. Ragnar took them beyond the gate in twos when the wind allowed it, out onto the river where the crust held under a careful foot, and then onto drifts where the crust did not hold, and taught them how to read where the snow had layered itself. "You will carry your queen out of a hall someday," she told them, "and down a stair, and across something that breaks under men who are too proud to go on their knees. A knee is not shame. It is the part of you that knows the ground." She put Gren on his back in a drift and taught him to roll without losing his sword. She taught Lem to run not fast, but with each foot knowing where it would land 3 steps before it did. At night, Brienne walked, because she did not know how not to. The iron stair gave her palm up to her glove now with less stain. Someone had brushed it with oil in a quiet hour. The door with the wedge had learned that it would be touched, and had ceased to try to hide it. In the corridor by the buttery, she found a thread of blue under a stone, no more than the length of the nail on her thumb, and it made the shape of a road in her head that ran from White Harbor to a hand with a cough. She filed the thought with the other threads until she had enough to tie a knot. Orin sang in the hall at odd hours, as minstrels do when they are trying to learn the way a place breathes. He sang for the children in the afternoon, rude little things about geese and kings that made the smallest boys fall over backward, and the tallest girls pretend to roll their eyes before they laughed anyway. He sang once in the kitchens a soft song that made the very air taste sweeter. Gage, who had taught boys to cut onions for 3 kings and never learned to be impressed by a southern voice, came out to stand in the doorway and wipe his hands on his apron and listen with his mouth open. He sang for Sansa alone one morning when the queen was not alone, because queens never are. He sang of a city that had once been brave, and then had been tired, and then had remembered how to be brave again, and he did not say which city. Sansa listened with her hands still, and said only, "Yet," when he was done, and he understood that he had been permitted a small thing, and had best keep it small. The Vale answered the polite letter first, as Jaina had guessed they would, with paragraphs about mutual benefit, and an obsequious little line that gave Sansa's title its flourish, and then braced itself as if expecting to be corrected. They did not answer the brave letter at all. They answered the slow letter last, and with care, and in it, there was a sentence that did not match the hand that had written the rest. Cramped, as if a man used to a different script had forced his fingers to fit another shape. The sentence asked if the Queen in the North had read the old agreement sealed when children were sent to the Eyrie to learn to be stones among the sky. Sansa read it 3 times and then looked at Brienne. "They want me to remember," she said, "that my childhood touched their rock. Stones rolled downhill," Davos muttered. "They do not rise up to their senders." We will answer only with talk of grain, Sansa decided. We will not argue the past with men who think the past belongs to them. Alizen brought news from Bear Island 2 days later, a letter written in a hand that would have suited a sword better than a quill, and a small wooden bear, carved by a child, which she held without apology. The letter spoke of ice floes, and a ship with a black sail sighted in a place where ships went only when they were lost, or cruel. They will not come to White Harbor, Diana said, because my cousin slit a man's ear there for mistaking a knife for a toll. But they may come to Barrowton if fools tell them to. Sansa's eyes went to Brienne then, and Brienne felt the weight of travel settle into her bones, and set them burning the way a good burden does. We will go to Barrowton, Sansa said. We will visit Lady Barbary whether she wishes it or not, because I will not have men say that the North does not speak to its barrows. They set out when the road could be trusted to hold a queen's sleigh and a few riders, without breaking into the black water under the skin. The sky was a lid of pewter that day. A wind from the west made the trees whisper, as if someone had told them a secret, and they could not keep from passing it. Sansa rode in the sleigh under fox and wool, and a discipline she had practiced until it looked like ease. Davos rode beside with his hood up, and his hand on the bow that had never made him feel like a man of the sea. Brienne rode ahead with Ragna on her right, Hareth somewhere she could not see, and Gren where she could hear him breathe. Podrick counted the breath of the horses without knowing he did, and hummed under it a fragment of Orin's song that sounded like a man making peace with his own steps. Barrowton rose out of the flat like a thought. The barrows themselves were white-shouldered and old beyond the kind of number that tires a man's mouth. Lady Barbary Dustin stood at the top of the ramp with a look like ice that has seen too many winters to be impressed by this one. "Your Grace," she said, and the words came out cold enough to keep. Then she smiled, a very small smile that made the lines beside her eyes admit that warmth is a thing one chooses to possess. "We would have swept the steps if we had known you would come, but the wind does not accept bribes, nor does snow," Sansa said. "It accepts lessons." They spoke of roads and horses, and the price of oats, as women talk, when waiting to decide whether they will speak of knives. Barbary had always been a woman who told men what women thought of them, and watched their eyes to see if they were worth the words. She looked at Brienne with curiosity that did not seek to weaken her. "Do you love any queen but the dead one?" she asked at last with the kind of cruelty that is also courtesy, because it spares a woman the cost of hearing the question later from a fool. "I love the living with the oaths I kept," Brienne said. Barbary nodded, satisfied. "Then teach my grooms to keep a horse's feet under it on this ice," she said. "I have lads who think that because they learned to stand up once on a hull, they know everything water can do." They ate a stew in a room that had been designed to prove that men can build warmth when the world makes it hard. The wood cracked in the hearth. Ragna accepted a cup of ale and looked into it as if reading the wind there. Hareth stood by the door that led to the inner rooms and watched the hinge breathe. Sansa and Barbary spoke of the King's Road, and Barbary spoke of the men who came along it at night without torches, and Sansa did not flinch when the older woman named 3 lords who had sent men to ask how much the North charged for its winter. "What did you tell them?" Sansa asked. "That the North has never been able to command its price," Barbary said. "Only to show what happens if it is not paid." "Show them again," Sansa said. On the way back, they met a sledge broken down in the lee of a stand of birch. 3 men and a woman with the posture of someone who had given up too many hours' sleep to a child that would not be kept warm. The sledge runners had chewed themselves to ruin against ice that had grown a crust of grit. It would not move without new iron. Brienne put her shoulder to the tail of the sledge and felt the muscles take the things she asked of them and do them. Gren grunted and learned in the doing that his body would answer if he did not ask it in a voice that frightened it. Ragna tied a line and a knot that was not quite a sailor's and not quite a hunter's, but would hold against wind. Hareth kept his eyes on the tree line. Sansa climbed out of the sleigh and stood on the road in the kind of cold that eats fingers, and made herself visible to the woman in the sledge, with the posture and the child. "What is your name?" she asked. "Elisa," the woman said, suspicious of kindness in the way of all who have been given too little for too long. "We are going to Barrowton." You are going to Winterfell first, Sansa said. You will eat and sleep, and then go on. Men who attempt to cross my land in this season without rest end up as stories, and we have enough of those. Then Elisa looked at her, as if to measure what price this kindness would demand. We have nothing to give, she said. You will tell me, Sansa said, how the road was near the ford. That is what I ask. And you will tell me the color of the scarf of the woman who counted your oats at the last toll, and if you saw any mummers, and whether the boy with you wets the bed, in case I need to find him a pallet that can be scrubbed without bruising. These are my prices. And oh, Elisa laughed then, a rusty sound that turned warm on the end. Brienne found herself smiling without meaning to, and then sobered because smiling does not move a sledge. They got the sledge to the place where the road skin was smoother, and then sent it on with one of Barbrae's men. And Sansa stood on the lip of the ditch and looked at the sky as if listening to a song there. If it snows big, she said, we'll shelter at Long Lake. If it snows small, we'll press on. If it gives us ice in teeth and nothing in hands, we will curse and go anyway. Then, small, Podrick predicted shyly, and Ragnar looked at him, surprised. He was rarely wrong about the way sky turns to ground. They made Winterfell at dusk with the wind deciding, in an uncharitable mood, to turn and slap the gates with its sleeve. The fires in the hall were little suns. Orin's voice wound through the clamor, a tune about barrows and the kind of wives who make men live longer. The troop master and 2 of his men were in the steward's custody under blankets and a watch that rarely blinked. Lem sat near the door and tried to make himself at once noticed and not. Brienne cuffed his ear lightly as she passed, and he straightened with a start that made him grin. Sansa took her seat and listened to Davos news, of which letters had been answered, and which had not while she was gone. The polite letter had earned them a pledge of escorts that would come in spring if the roads thawed without tantrums. The slow letter had earned them silence. The brave letter had earned a small jest scribbled in the margin of a separate page about the thickness of northern ice. Sansa set the jest aside and ate a bowl of stew that Ragnar had decided needed more salt and that Sansa did not argue with. A child spilled a cup, and Brienne saw 3 men move at once to save the cup and the child and the man's pride. She nodded and decided to give them each an extra hour of sleep when she was deciding on watches later. They brought the man with the cleaver jaw to a small room where the walls were close enough to make lies harder to build into anything. He told them the names he had, and one of the names was a man in White Harbor who had once weighed fish and had lately weighed other things, and found that iron was easier on the hands than scales. We will send this name to Daena, Sansa said, and she will put it into her pocket and carry it around the hall until it grows hot enough to burn, and then she will take it out and do something with it. The man asked if he would be killed, and Sansa said, not today, in a way that made the word a thing like bread. He wept, briefly, and then stopped, embarrassed at having had a life in front of people. At the end of a long day, Brienne stood again in the godswood, and let the face in the tree find her. The snow had come small as Podrick had said it would, delicate and full of impatience, as if even the sky were too busy for big. Her breath made ghosts, and then gave up. She knelt, because her knees wanted to, and because it does a woman good sometimes to be nearer to the ground than to her own head. I will keep her, she said to the red leaves and to no one at all. I will keep the shape of her realm. I will keep the smallness and the largeness both. I will keep boys from being used as weights. I will keep the door that should not open from opening. I will keep my sword from being drawn for pride. I will keep my silence when it is needed. I will keep my voice when it is not. Mend her. The face did not move. The branches gave up a little snow that fell without ceremony and found the gray of her cloak and made it whiter. She thought of Catelyn then, not with the pang that had once made her chest a cage, but with the sort of love that can stand in the same room with other obligations and not make them smaller. She thought of Jaime, because thinking of him had become like thinking of an old wound that no longer kept her from using the limb. It twinged in weather. She thought of Sansa, and the steadiness there, and the cost of that steadiness, and the fact that the world did not give men prices for their steadiness most days. When she rose, the night had found its deeper blue. Podrick stood at the edge of the grove where he always waited when he knew she meant to be alone and would not be. He held out his glove to her and said, "You drop this," and she took it and did not say that she had not. He fell into step beside her, and they walked without speaking, which is a thing only friends can do without feeling the need to decorate. 2 days later, a basket arrived from the weaver's widow full of red mufflers cut from the cloak and stitched with small wolves in black thread that had been dyed with walnut hulls. She sold them in the market for half a goose each, and people bought them not because they were warm, though they were, but because they were another way of saying, "We see what you are doing, and we remember it." A child wore one and called himself a knight until his mother told him knights were southern, and he said he would be a guard then, and stood in the door with his stick and let no cat pass without a countersign. Sansa ordered one muffler put aside for Elisa at the sledge. "Send it with the salt pork," she said, "and tell her that no queen likes to see a child's neck cold." The singer's ring stopped moving so much on his finger. He learned the names of the men who carried wood into the hall, and of the women who told those men where to put the wood. He learned to make his voice carry only as far as he meant it, and no farther. Brienne watched him with the curiosity due a man who had presented himself as a collection of strings and proved to be something more. She asked him, one evening when the hall's sound had gentled, "Do you carry letters as well as songs?" "I carry songs that have writing inside them," he said. "Letters make my pockets heavy and my conscience light." Then, after a pause, "If you want to send something to King's Landing that is not a letter, I know a tune." "I do," she said, "but not yet." She wanted first to see whether the woman in the blue scarf by the harbor would turn up when Diana's cousins put the right bait on the wall. She wanted to see what a man in White Harbor would do when the plate he expected to find was not delivered, and, instead, he found a basket of mufflers and a letter that said only, "Too warm to cheat." She wanted to see if the veil would try again to fit her queen into a sentence that bent her neck. She wanted to see if the Riverlands would send back word that the bandit levies had found someone to pay them. She wanted to see if a ship with a black sail would show itself on a day when the wind forgot to be discreet. Winter is a season of watching. It is also a season of work. Brienne learned how the castle wanted to be guarded and made it so without teaching the castle to resent it. She set watches not where men expected to stand, but where they would learn to hear new things. She turned the habit of the lower corridor into a practice. She made the men who liked the light stand 2 shifts a week in the dark. She had them write down what they heard and saw and smelled and felt with their hands and feet and noses and eyes. And when the maester grumbled that a guard was not a clerk, she said, "Then let a clerk teach him to write what matters." And the maester went away muttering and came back with sand and patience. Sansa ruled a north that had learned to respect itself for surviving and not to boast about the fact. She spoke often of sauces because it amused her to make men use the word in councils, and because it made the talk remember it. It served meals at the end of it. She supervised the mending of a dozen small things and the plan for 2 larger ones. She listened to a woman from the winter town tell a long story about a stolen hen, and then turned the story into a judgment that made both the hen and the friendship between the woman and her neighbor more likely to survive the spring thaw. She answered letters with the exact number of lines required to teach the writer that she had read the words and would not be tricked by the shapes behind them. She let the hall see her walk and sit and eat and chide and laugh and look at the fire. She let the hall believe that it knew her without letting it know how much she kept inside. And then, one morning that began like a boy's lie, bright and quickly complicated, the raven came from the neck with a note tied in a reed knot that Gianna's kin would recognize 3 miles away and a fishwife would call pretty string. The note said in very few words, "Players on the water. Boat painted to look like a cart. Nails in their boots. Coming slow." Brienne folded the note in a way that would not break the reeds and looked at Ragna. Ragna's eyes had the focused ease of a hawk before the stoop. "We will meet them where the water pretends to be a road," she said. The place was a crossing 2 days south where the marsh sent a tongue out to lick the King's Road. Men had always tried to cheat time there by cutting a bend with a plank path. In summer it was a gift. In winter it was a risk men took because they were tired of listening to their own feet. Brienne took Gren and Lem because she wanted boys to remember the smell of a bad decision before they made one, and Sira because short blades are good in narrow places, and Harith because a plank path is a conversation between wood and water, and he was fluent in both. Yana drifted away with a smile, and they pretended not to know where she went. Ragna tied her hair down and checked the cords on her spare knife. They reached the place at dawn and waited. Waiting is a craft. Brienne practiced it with a stillness she had borrowed from trees. Harith counted his own breath for the comfort of it. Sarah pretended to sleep with her back against a stump. Gren tried to look at nothing and saw everything. Lem chewed a piece of dry bread and did not ask when he could have more. He learned which questions make a woman decide, "You are not ready." The boat came out of the morning mist with the dignity of a thing that has convinced itself it is something else. It had been painted with the clumsy care a poor man gives a cart he hopes will be allowed through a gate. From a certain angle in a certain light, a guard half asleep could be persuaded not to see water under it. A man walked on the plank path ahead of it with a pole and the kind of gate that says, "Nothing to see here." Another man behind whistled a tune which he broke off every time he forgot it and resumed in a different key. The nails in his boots were modest, as if he suspected the ground would tell on him. Brienne let them come into the narrow. When the boat was at the place where the plank path dipped slightly, because one post had rotted in a way that promised to survive until spring, and then betray a man's confidence. Stepped out from behind a birch and said, They stopped, wisely. The man with the pole looked at her and measured her height and her sword and the way her cloak hung. He tried a smile and found it froze on his teeth. "Morning," he said, as if surprised to find himself the kind of man who says morning to a woman with a blade. "We're taking a clever route is all." "You are trying to make a river think it's a road," Brienne said. "It is not clever. It is unkind to the river." "Is the river your friend?" he asked, with a touch of scorn he regretted at once. "It will be if I keep it," she said. "Who told you this path would be empty?" The men glanced at each other. The boat gave a little bump against a plank and made a sound like a cough. Lem, who had never learned to be patient with silence, stepped forward and put his hand on the boat's gunwale. "Show her the plates," he said, and the men froze in the way men do when a boy grows a spine in front of them. They had the plates. They had 3, because Yaina's kin had eased another 3 out of their hands in the night, at a different place with the sort of courtesy Boggs have perfected. Quiet, thorough, unregarded. They had 2 letters wrapped in oiled pigot. One was a ledger page with harmless lines of charges for apples and onions, and a note about a broken barrel. And in the space between 2 tallies, there was the faintest scratch that meant someone had written and then rubbed away a name. The other was a small square folded into itself with practice. It had no seal. Harith held it like a man who has carried too many fragile things down too many stairs. "What is written," Brienne said, "does not leave your mouth unless asked." She opened the square. The words were sparse and careful, and their very care betrayed the writer. They said, "The play is set. Queensman to be pulled from his place. Lake to make a stage. The red cloak will be worn. Our man will cast his line 5 mornings after this leaves King's Landing. They will wait 2 more days if the fish are shy. A letter that is not a letter will tell us where to haul." Brienne folded the square back into itself and put it in her glove. "You will come to Winterfell," she said, "where you will be made to explain your cleverness to a hall that has learned to count and to a queen who has learned to take off a man's pride without breaking his bones." The men shifted their weight, as men do when considering if they are brave enough, foolish enough, hungry enough, desperate enough to run. They were not. Ragna smiled at them in a way that would have sent wiser men to priesthoods. Sarah rubbed the edge of her blade on her sleeve absent-mindedly. Gren looked as if he could pick up the boat and carry it home. They came. In the hall that afternoon, Sansa listened to them with the same attention she gave to a woman who claimed her neighbor's goat had eaten the hem of a dress. She asked them if they were ashamed of the work. The Paulman said no honestly. The Whistler said a little, and wondered aloud if he would be given the chance not to be ashamed of something else. "You will be given a broom," Sansa said, "and a corner no one likes. If you sweep it clean and do not steal anything that can be lifted by a man with your back, we will see if you belong to the corner or to the road." Nenania wall. She looked at Brienne then, and Brienne took the folded square from her glove and gave it to the queen without comment. Sansa read it and did not let the hall read her. She handed it to Davos next, and he grunted and said, "Lake," in a tone that made the word a warning. "Long Lake," Sansa said. "They meant to make a stage of it. They meant to pull a queensman from his place, and dress him in red, and make us watch him drown on a stage painted with a cart." "Man, they... whom?" Brienne asked, not because she had not already begun to guess, but because the question must be asked aloud in such a room. They looked at the men who loved the queen most, and at the men the hall believed the queen leaned on. They looked at Davos, and he looked back, and shook his head with a small smile that had no humor in it, as if to say he had made worse stages, and not been drowned. They looked at Maester Wolkan, and laughed, because a man with ink on his hands is rarely the kind of man a plotter chooses. A few looked at Alysanne, and then at once away. No one with sense tried to haul a she-bear off anything. A few looked at Brienne, and the looks turned into the sort of puzzled air men get when they realize they haven't understood the question. Sansa's gaze went, at last, to the one man in the hall who was both loved and not seen, who moved through rooms at shoulder height, and whose absence would be felt like a dropped note in a familiar song. "Podrick," she said softly. He startled, then went still, and the stillness was acceptance and not fear. "Because I stand near you without making men nervous," he said, almost abashed. "Because they can dress me in anything, and I will not look like a lord. And because you are brave, and would go where someone told you to help a child or a dog." Ragnar said bluntly, "They do not pick their bait at random." Brienne felt the cold she had been keeping off herself find the seam in her cloak. She let it in. She would rather know the cold than pretend. "Then we will not let them pull him," she said. "We will not let them make a stage on my lake," Sansa said. "We will make our own play. We will use their cloak if we have to, and our mufflers if we like. We will show them they are not the only men who can make a story work. They set the thing up in a day because winter does not give you more." Jaina went to the lake and spoke to it, and then to the men who cut holes in it for fish, and then to the women who lay lines over it. She asked the lake to hold where it should be firm, and to let go where it should not. Hareth walked the old path along the reeds, and counted how many steps it took to hear your own voice come back, as if from a barrel. Ragnar climbed a tree, and listened for men with nails. Sarah and Gren and Lem made an accident in the square, and let men watch them take 6 breaths to decide what to do next. Sometimes letting a hall see your men decide is worth 10 speeches. Davos wrote a letter that was not a letter, and sent it on a cart that was not a cart, and swore softly in a language no one understood anymore when the wax cracked and had to be reheated, and then said again. And then they waited. Waiting is the great work of winter. Orin sang to the men on the wall, a song he called the Lake's Bride, and changed the words every time as if he were sewing something in the air. Brienne watched Podrick practice falling without making a splash. He did it with a grace that had nothing to do with prettiness, and everything to do with listening to instruction as if it were always going to be right. He tied the muffler the weaver's widow had kept aside for Elisa around his neck, because it pleased him to wear a piece of the red cloak, before anyone meant him to. Brienne wanted to tell him to take it off and did not. She would not teach him to be afraid of small things. They went to the lake in a snow that couldn't decide whether to commit. The men who would have pulled Podrick stood where men stand who think they have made the world turn their way, and are now waiting with the patience such men always think is theirs by right. The cloak that was not a cloak was in a basket beside them because they did not trust their own faces to bear it in the open. The boat that was not a cart had found a thin place, and had felt very pleased with itself for doing so. Brienne stepped into the play without greeting. She walked onto the ice with the slow tread Ragnar had taught her, and with the confidence she had earned elsewhere. She carried Oathkeeper without drawing it. She wore the gray cloak with the red leaves, and felt its clasp like a truth at her throat. "You will not rehearse my man today," she said. "The stage is wrong. The audience is wrong. The playwright has forgotten his ending. The men turned toward her as if called by a supper bell. One of them smiled a little without meaning to. He had thought himself safe behind a mask someone else had put on his face, and now realized he would have to learn his own expression. Another man, the one with the botched cunning, said, "We have no quarrel with you, sir," because he had not listened enough to know how the cloak was named. "You have a quarrel with my queen," Brienne said. "You have a quarrel with me." Podrick stood at the edge with a basket under his arm, looking guileless in a way that would only fool men who deserved their mistakes. He nodded once when he met Brienne's eyes, and she nodded back. The smallest tilt. Sarah had melted into reeds like a woman who had no interest in plays. Hareth was a shadow pressed flat against a stone. Yana was a rumor on wind. Ragna's absence was a blade. The men made the mistake of thinking they could force the ending they had been promised. One went for the basket. The ice spoke then, as ice speaks when it has been asked to hold and chooses a different answer. It cracked along a line that did not threaten the man who could not swim but did take the cleverness out of the boat for a moment. Podrick stumbled with an art that had been practiced and let the basket spin away from the reaching hand. Sarah came out of nothing and took the reaching wrist in a way that turned the rest of the man around his bones without breaking them. Gren took a step that was a choice and put his hand on a shoulder that thought it would not feel anything for another second, and made it feel a great deal immediately. Hareth kicked the butt of the pole so the boat turned half around and had to use its nails to find a different rhythm. Ginas' laughter came like a reed shaking when a frog jumps off it, and one of the men looked over his shoulder at the wrong moment and saw no one there and forgot to keep his feet. Brienne did what commanders do. She watched until watching would be neglect, and then she moved. Oathkeeper came up and out, not to cut, but to be a hand with a voice. Its weight said, "No." It said it in a language men learn in their knees. When a man swung at Podrick with the butt of a pike, as if Podrick were a stump to be tested for rot, Brienne set Oathkeeper's flat against the haft and pressed, and the man felt two things at once: that he had been stopped, and that he had been spared the sound of his own bone. He let go. It is easy to argue with a speech. It is hard to argue with a blade that chooses not to bite. It was over quickly, because men who rely on showmanship often forget to practice endings. They were made prisoners of a kind that the North believes in: alive, chagrined, cold, held. Podrick did not fall through, and he did not have to pretend to. He stood with his breath fogging and the muffler red as a berry at his neck, and the look on his face of a man who has been used as bait and has not let himself become the hook. Brienne looked at him and felt something like pride and something like fear wrestle in her chest, and agreed to take turns. They brought the men back to Winterfell and put them in a room that had been used once to teach boys to read and was now used to teach men to learn. Sansa listened to what they had to say and to the word that was not said but which Oren, in the corner of the room, played softly on a string. King's Landing. The words in the folded square had named it plainly. The ring on Oren's finger had recognized the weight of the script on that paper. "The city has learned to make plays that are not plays," Sansa said, "and to watch for applause where there should be none. We will not perform for them. Will you answer?" Davos asked, hand braced on the back of a chair as if on a deck. "Yes," Sansa said. "We will answer with a song that says, 'We saw you, we made a better ending, we ate well that night, the river is our friend.' We will answer with a letter that is not a letter carried by a man who does not call himself a singer. We will answer with a wagon that has the correct number of nails and a ledger whose clerk's hand is so good it looks like prayer. We will answer with a cloak sold as mufflers, and with children on the rod." "And with guards," Brienne said, and the word was a wall. Sansa inclined her head to her. "And with guards," she said, "who stand between my life and the stupidity of men who think a play in a lake can unmakes a queen." That night, when the hall had gone quiet in the way halls do when men trust their sleep, Brienne stood alone with Oathkeeper drawn, not to fight, but to remind herself that the blade had two edges: promise and threat. The old gods had sat all day in the snow and watched women do the work men wrote ballads about, and the work they did not. The heart tree stood like a witness who will never be cross-examined. Brienne held the sword up and watched the red in it carry back the light in small fragments that looked like names. She thought of the first night she had stood here and cut the air with her vow like a man cutting his bread. She thought of how much she had already kept and how much there was left to keep. She thought of the faces of men who had wanted to test a story and found that the story had teeth. She thought of a Queensguard that was 4 and would someday be 7. Not because 7 had magic in it, but because 7 would be enough to fill a hall with the sense that a queen was not alone. She thought of Podrick's muffler, and of Lem's fist, and of Gren's steady hand, and of Sira's ankle, and of Hareth's silence, and of Gianna's laugh, and of Ragna's scar, and of Alisane's blunt finger prodding her arm and saying, "Good." And beyond that, she thought, as a commander must if she is any good at all, of the next 3 doors. There would be the ship with the black sail sighted again where ice cannot be comfortable, and the men on it would call themselves traders and believe a queen in furs cannot tell the difference between trade and theft. There would be a lord in the Riverlands who would read Sansa's letter and decide to send his men to Winterfell anyway for warmth and pride and later regret. They would need to be fed and taught to tell a fishwife from a thief. There would be another letter from the Vale with a sentence that tutored Sansa about the proper maintenance of falconries, as if birds taught in thin air could tell wolves how to feed. There would be one of Sansa's own men who had not meant to be a traitor and would be given a chance to remember what his own name felt like between his teeth before he said it to the wrong ear. There would be boys who needed to learn to stand and fall. There would be girls who would teach them. There would be a winter to outlast and a spring to be ready for on the day it chose to trust them with the thaw. Brienne lowered Oathkeeper, and the blade thought nothing of her thoughts. It was a tool. She was the hand that used it. She slid it home and felt in the motion. A rightness that was not glory and not pride and not joy, but that belonged to the family of those words. She turned and went back into the castle and closed the door behind her, because that is what you do when you guard a queen. You go where the doors are and you make them behave.